Thank you for playing the Reacting to the Past game, Engines of Mischief. This PowerPoint is to help players make arguments from contemporary primary sources, and in this case, about factories and political reform. Don't forget our game is set in the Industrial Revolution in Manchester, England, in the years 1817 and 1818. Players will be required to make arguments to convince aristocrats in town hall to pass laws. What the laws are that can be passed and what are the topics of each session depends on the game you're playing and the game master's choice. But in this video, we're going to assume that this is the second session of town hall where players will be talking about factory conditions and child labor. And then it also will cover Town Hall 3, which would be about political reform. So we start with factories. Again, all of the arguments from primary sources can be found in the core text of the game book. In this case, there's reports of minutes of evidence taken for a committee about the state of children in factories in Britain in 1816, the year before our game starts. So some possible bills that could be passed in town hall would be to restrict child labor, to mandate safe factory conditions, maybe to regulate work hours and days. So we'll go over some arguments for and against all of these things. So first we'll talk about arguments in favor of child labor in factories. And we begin with this because it's going to be very unfamiliar to players in the 21st century. But they were common arguments at the So the first set of arguments comes from reports of a testimony to the committee about the state of children in factories at this time period. And some of them begin just by describing how many children and what ages the children are in the factories. And you can see here that some of them can be as young as 8 or 9 years old and can work 12 hours a day with only a few breaks during the day. So this is our first argument for why children should be allowed to work in factories, and it's very easy. Basically, because parents want their children to work. They need the extra money, and so they really want to have the ability to send their children to work for the extra money. Here's a second argument for why children should be allowed to work in factories and that the government should not pass laws restricting their labor. This one argues that factory work does not harm children. It's not particularly hard. Children are just attending the machines, so it doesn't hurt them because of that. And the evidence for this is that the children are strong and as healthy as any other children. Here are a few more arguments. First, because if children can work, it means that they get a wage. And what this does is it means that poor families are less poor because they get the wage of their children working, which means they don't have to rely on the poor law, get help, go to the workhouse. This means that poor rates are lower. Children are necessary in factories, according to this testimony, because they're better workers, they have subtle fingers, they can get underneath machines, they're more obedient. This person also thinks that having children work in factories keeps them out of trouble, helps them not develop bad habits of doing nothing, of idleness. So it's good for the children. It also teaches them order and discipline. The next set of arguments are about why the hours of children can't be reduced. So this could be a law that was passed reducing hours that children work. And this person argues that they can't reduce the hours of children because then they would have to reduce the hours of all workers, including adults, which will bring the factory to a standstill and reduce production and profit. And what this would do is it means that wages for all the workers would have to be lowered because profit is less. Here's another argument for why the hours of children can't be reduced, or the hours of adults, and that is by reducing the hours, it will make British textiles more expensive because more workers will have to be hired, which means that the British textiles cannot compete with foreign producers, and this might lead to the bankruptcy of the textile industry, which certainly doesn't help workers because then they don't have jobs. So now we have some arguments against child labor in factories. These people would be arguing that the government should restrict how children work in factories. The first set of arguments is basically that factory work harms children. The hours are too long for children. This injures the health of children. It leads to things like stunted growth, lack of strength, poor digestion, and this testimony also points out that children are susceptible to glandular swellings and to lung diseases from the cotton that is in the air in the factories. This testimony is again about how factory work harms the health of children, that they're weak, that the glandular swellings are a disease called scrofula, and also this mentions that there are lots of accidents that children are susceptible to, that, often because of inattention or carelessness, they become crippled by being entangled in the machinery. And here's yet again some more evidence for why factory work harms the health of children. The cotton flu that's in the air gets in their lungs. It also gets in their stomachs so that they have to take emetics, which causes them to throw up and to throw up the cotton flu. They're exhausted from running around for the work they do. The factories are often overheated, and the children also get asthma. Here again are arguments about why factory work is not good for children, about how overheated the factories are, how there is no ventilation, and all of these arguments can be used about factory conditions in general for adults as well as children. But if we're talking about children specifically, there are additional arguments about how it's unhealthy for them or bad for them to work in factories because they don't have any free time. There's no recreation that's allowed. They're either working or have very short breaks for lunch or dinner. There are also more details about how many accidents children are subject to in the factories, the danger of the machines from the shafts and cylinders, and how children are more likely to get caught up in them, and how children have been crushed to death, and that contemporaries have actually seen this very frequently. So there are fatal accidents, and that especially affect. And here are some final arguments about how factory work is bad for the morals of children. They don't have time to go to Sunday school, so they don't have any religion. They don't have time to go to any school, so they don't have education. They understand that their wage is essential to the family economy, so they are disobedient to their parents because they know that their parents rely on them. And finally, they're rude to their superiors. In some cases, they're so insulting that adults even cross the street rather than pass groups of factory working children. So now we'll move on from factory conditions and child labor, of which there is more evidence in the court texts that players can refer to. But we're going to move on to political reform. And this can include arguing for a variety of bills to change the political system at the time. So, in terms of political reform, don't forget that Britain at this time is a limited monarchy. The king or queen has to rule with the representatives of the people, but it is not a democracy. Only the aristocrats and very wealthy can vote for members of parliament, and even less can become members of parliament. So Britain was a constitutional monarchy, but only 5% of the population could vote. Also, the aristocrats in the House of Lords can veto the House of Commons, and the House of Commons was the house where people were elected. So again, it was not a democracy. And this is because there were very high property qualifications for people to vote, and these required land ownership, not liquid capital. So this means that it's really the aristocrats and the very, very wealthy who can buy land who are able to vote. There were reform movements at the time of our game demanding changes to the political system. The most radical ones wanted universal male suffrage, but there were reformers who wanted just the property qualifications to be reduced a little bit so that the wealthy middle class could vote. So players in our game can make arguments for any of these things. Don't forget that the fear of the French Revolution was very intense, and there were lots of people at this time who thought that any call for political reform would lead to a revolution like the French Revolution, would just open the floodgates. And again, here's another cartoon indicating that the idea of reform, particularly of radical reform, which was universal manhood suffrage, would bring the French Revolution to Britain. And the government was so afraid of radical reform that it did pass some very serious laws to try to stop people arguing for it. So now we can look at some of the core texts in the game book that talks about political reform. There's some newspaper articles and that will give some of the key arguments. So again, possible bills would be lowering the property qualification so middle classes can vote and serve as members of parliament, universal male suffrage, or universal suffrage including women as well. So arguments for political reform, if Engines of Mischief is played with a game like the French Revolution game, students can also use other ideas from an earlier time period, for example, Locke and Rousseau. But for our time period, here is a passage from an article to the Times outlining some arguments for universal male suffrage made by Major Cartwright. And the key argument is, without the right to vote, Englishmen are not free. They are slaves, they are chained, as in this cartoon. And also the idea that all men, perhaps not women, but all men have an equal right to vote and to participate in government. Here's some other arguments, basically that Parliament has done a terrible job. Parliament, where only the aristocrats can serve, has done a terrible job. They've created a huge debt with the unnecessary wars with France. They've increased taxes to pay for the debt. Also, it could be argued that the tax structure only helps the aristocrats in government, so that there is a need to have more people in government to change that tax structure. This argument is also that the aristocrats currently are stifling political and religious freedom by having a standing army. And again, they're using the taxes to help themselves while the majority of the people are unhappy and suffering. And this could be things like the Corn Laws and the repeal of the income tax. This cartoon shows, again, the reasons people wanted reform of Parliament. That the unreformed Parliament is basically killing John Bull, Britain, with lost liberties, despotism, tyranny, and bad taxes, bad corn laws. So basically, the Parliament, as it is now constituted, is doing a bad job, and people want to rise again and have John Bull be healthy again with more people participating in the government. Now for some arguments against political reform. Again, this is the fear of the French Revolution, the Jacobin spirit, which is the spirit of the French Revolution. So reform will bring the ideas of the French Revolution, and the fear is that it will take away property of the rich. So if the lower classes are allowed to vote and sit in Parliament, they will use Parliament to pass laws taking away the property of the rich. This will end up hurting the poor, because the rich won't be able to create jobs. It'll end in violence, with the execution perhaps of the monarch, his family, punishment of aristocrats, the nationalization of the church. Here again is another argument that the poor should not be allowed to vote. So maybe the middle class, but certainly not to the poor, because their poverty makes them so miserable that they can't think rationally, they don't have any public sense, they're stupid, and they're also selfish. They only think of themselves, not the good of the entire nation. And particularly females, women should not have the right to vote, and this cartoon illustrates how ridiculous people at the time who were against changing the political system thought of the idea of women having the right to vote. And in this cartoon, there's a little picture of a woman holding up a baby with a cap of liberty of the French Revolution and two daggers in their hands, indicating that this is going to hurt not just women, but the entire future of Britain. So those are some arguments that can be made. Again, players should consult the core text of the game book and do additional research to make arguments about political reform and factory conditions in our game.